The movie kicks off by introducing a guy named Joe. Joe works at a company and has a complicated life. He's got an ex-wife and a cute 2-year-old daughter named Mia. Joe is known for being a bit of a troublemaker. He's into drinking way too much, and he doesn't always act properly, like peeing where he shouldn't. One day, Joe's boss asks him to convince a client to work with their company. But when the client goes to the bathroom, Joe doesn't focus on business. Instead, he tries to flirt with the client's girlfriend and suggests they spend the night together. It turns out the client catches Joe in the act, and he gets mad and slaps Joe right in the face. After that, it shows Joe getting drunk on the side of the road and vomiting. In the pouring rain, Joe heads over to his friend's bar, named Chucky. But since Joe's had a bit too much to drink, and the bar's already closed, Chucky won't let him in. So Joe stumbles away and, by pure chance, bumps into a lady holding a yellow umbrella. Joe suddenly tries to flirt with her, but it turns out she's actually on a mission from her boss to kidnap him. Before he knows it, Joe fell unconscious, thanks to a sedative from the lady with the yellow umbrella. When he finally wakes up, he's in what looks like a hotel room, but this place is actually an isolation facility. Joe's scratching his head, wondering why he got kidnapped and stuck here, and he's also curious how long he's got to stay. They feed Joe 3 times a day, but it's the same menu every time. Eventually, Joe decides to ask the person bringing his food why he's been kidnapped and kept all alone. But this person just acts like Joe's not even there and doesn't give him any answers. While Joe was watching TV one day, he saw a woman showing off some dance moves that got him all worked up. It had been a long time since he'd been with anyone, so he decided to relieve himself. But just as he's feeling satisfied, smoke starts filling the room and Joe passes out. Suddenly, someone rushes in and collects Joe's DNA, fingerprints, and even the bodily fluids he left behind. Turns out, this person is doing it on orders from the real perpetrator who kidnapped Joe. They want to frame Joe for the murder and rape of his ex-wife. The next day, Joe hears the shocking news that his ex-wife has been killed after a terrible assault, and he is accused of committing the crime with all the fake evidence from the day before. But Joe still has no clue why he's caught up in this nightmare. Years have passed and Joe's still trapped in that same hotel room. Loneliness eats at him, and he starts talking to a pillow like it's his buddy. Then, one day, he stumbles upon a white mouse and becomes his company. Not long after, the white mouse has a whole bunch of babies, and Joe's heart breaks when they turn the mice into a meal. He can't take it anymore, and he thinks about doing something drastic. But for some reason, the hotel staff won't let him go, like they're keeping him alive against his will. After many years, Joe was watching TV and saw a report about his daughter Mia playing a musical instrument. It turns out Mia had been adopted by a loving couple who promised to take care of her. This news gave Joe a renewed sense of purpose. He decided to keep writing letters to Mia so that she would know he wasn't the one who hurt her mother. He also started working out to get in better shape, believing that one day he'd be free and able to reunite with Mia and get back at the person who did this to him. In the following month, Joe began his escape plan by slowly removing bricks from the bathroom wall. Just when he was about to make his getaway, he heard some news that Mia might be willing to give him another chance. This filled Joe with happiness and hope, but then, out of nowhere, smoke filled the room and he passed out. It turned out the hotel staff had caught on to his escape plan. After 20 long years, Joe finally gets released and finds himself inside a box. It turns out the person who had kidnapped him gave him some money and a cell phone. As Joe goes through the letters he wrote to Mia all those years, he spots a woman with a yellow umbrella, just like the one he saw 2 decades ago. Without thinking twice, Joe starts chasing after her. But when he catches up, a group of young guys think he's about to do bad things and attack him. So Joe has to defend himself against them, and the woman with the yellow umbrella slips away. After dealing with the young men, Joe resumes his pursuit of the person with the yellow umbrella, only to find out it's now a man. Joe decides to confront the innocent guy, but a woman named Marie steps in and stops him. Mary explains that she's a nurse working at a clinic and, seeing Joe in a panic, gives him her business card in case he needs medical help. Later on, Joe goes over to Chucky's place. Chucky is shocked because Joe's been gone for 2 whole decades with no word. Joe starts pouring out his entire story to Chucky. And then out of the blue, the cell phone given to him by his kidnapper starts ringing. It's a mysterious guy claiming to be the one who locked Joe up for all those years. Joe then asks Chucky to help him dig into this mystery online. Joe tries to remember who might have done this to him, starting with his clients, old bosses, and anyone he used to hang out with. They spend hours searching, but Chucky gets tired and decided to sleep. Meanwhile, Joe continued his search. The next day, Chucky finds Joe passed out, probably from being tired. He quickly reaches out to a nurse whose business card he found in Joe's pocket. Turns out the nurse's name is Marie. Marie gives Joe some medical attention and takes a peek at the letters Joe wrote about himself, searching for the perpetrator who had kept him captive for 20 years. Right then, Joe woke up and quickly shuffled through his letters before Marie could get a look. But Marie had already known that Joe was searching for the perpetrator. She then offered to help him. Joe and Marie started hunting down the person who had called Joe before. Joe had a hunch to track down the restaurant that supplied the meal to the hotel where he'd been locked up for 20 years. He remembered the taste of that food all too well. Joe went from one restaurant to another until he was sure that one of them had been sending food to that same hotel. Then he tailed a shady person who seemed to be part of the mafia, buying a ton of food. Turns out that guy led Joe straight back to the place where he'd been held captive all those years. Joe, armed with a hammer, bravely stormed in and took down the guards without a second thought. Eventually, he came face to face with the boss of the captivity joint, a guy named Cheney. Turns out Cheney was running an illegal business where people got locked up based on his client's wishes. Joe tried to push Cheney to reveal the identity of the client, who had ordered him to lock Joe up all those years. Unfortunately, Cheney had no clue about it. Instead, he told Joe to listen to a recording sent by the real perpetrator. When Joe played the recording, it turned out the guy had told Cheney to keep Joe locked up for 2 decades, but never gave a reason. After that, Joe tried to escape from the place as Cheney's men started arriving. While trying to hold Cheney down, Joe warned his men not to make a move if they wanted to keep Cheney alive. But at one point, Cheney broke free, and Joe had no choice but to take on all of Cheney's men. He managed to disable them, but he also got himself pretty banged up. Just as he was about to passing out, he was suddenly taken to Chucky's house by someone. Turns out it was the same guy who'd kept him captive for 20 years. Not long after, Marie and Chucky took care of Joe until he got better. Then, one day, Joe was at Chucky's bar when out of nowhere, the perpetrator contacted him. Joe was shocked to find out the guy was already there. Filled with anger, Joe tried to attack him, but his men quickly stopped him. That's when the perpetrator revealed that he was the one who had kept Joe captive for 20 years, had assaulted Joe's wife to death, and had falsely accused Joe. The perpetrator, trying to justify his actions, told Joe that there was a reason behind all of this. He then gave Joe a challenge. He wanted Joe to guess 2 things. First, who he really was, and second, why he'd kept Joe locked up for 2 decades. The perpetrator gave Joe 2 days, and if Joe could figure it out, the perpetrator promised to do the unthinkable. Not only that, he'd hand over $20 million in diamonds to Joe. But if Joe failed, the perpetrator threatened to kill both Joe and his daughter, Mia. Joe then got together with Marie to help him solve the 2 questions the perpetrator had thrown at him. They eventually found a lead in the form of a piece of music that was the perpetrator's phone ringtone. Every time the perpetrator called Joe, that same music played. It turned out the music led them to a school called Evergreen Academy, which Joe had attended once. Joe and Marie headed over to the school to dig into its records. However, it turned out that the school had been closed for a long time, and they were also not allowed to enter by the guard. They hatched a plan to sneak in at night, and while they were waiting for darkness, they stayed at a motel not far from the school. As they spent time together, Joe and Marie grew closer, and there was a spark of attraction between them. Until, when Marie finished showering, something happened. It turned out that it was monitored by the perpetrator because all of this was part of the perpetrator's plan. That night, Joe and Marie sneaked back into the school to search for records. After a bit of searching, Joe finally found out that the guy who'd kept him captive for 20 years was named Adrian Price. The Price family was wealthy, but most of them had been killed, leaving only Adrian behind. When Joe looked back on the past, he realized that Amanda Price, Adrian's younger sister, was the reason he'd been locked up by Adrian. Apparently, Joe had caught Amanda in a compromising situation with her biological father, and that's what triggered everything. After that incident, Joe went as far as spreading false rumors that Amanda had seduced her own father, which led to the students at school bullying her even more and thinking badly of her. Now, Joe finally understands that Adrian, the guy who kidnapped him, did it as revenge for what Joe had falsely accused his sister of in the past. When Joe on his way to meet Adrian to answer his 2 questions, Marie tries to stop him, fearing for his safety at Adrian's hands. But Joe assures Marie that he'll be okay and promises to come back safely. On the journey to meet Adrian, he shows Joe a video of his daughter, Mia, who is now in Adrian's custody. Joe pleads with Adrian not to harm Mia, as she's innocent and has nothing to do with all of this. When Joe arrived at Adrian's place, he wasted no time asking about Mia's whereabouts. But one of Adrian's henchmen immediately attacks Joe. But this time, Joe manages to eliminate the henchman. After that, Adrian repeated the same questions he'd asked before. Joe revealed that the bad guy's name was Adrian Price, and the reason Adrian had kept Joe locked up for so long was because he held a grudge against Joe for ruining his sister Amanda's reputation. Joe had spread false rumors about her. Adrian explained that after Joe's actions, Amanda became deeply depressed and isolated herself in her room. Their father, feeling equally ashamed, decided to do something unthinkable. He planned to eliminate the entire family, including Amanda. Adrian, however, was spared by their father under the condition that he would seek revenge on Joe for what had happened. Then his father did the unthinkable in front of Adrian. Afterward, Joe was taken to a room where he learned that Adrian had manipulated the TV news he watched while he was in isolation regarding Mia. The woman he thought was Mia turned out to be someone Adrian had paid. Then, Adrian revealed the real Mia, who was actually Marie, the person Joe had been involved with. Adrian had been planning this revenge for years, even changing Mia's name to Marie when she was young. Realizing this, Joe felt overwhelmed with guilt and shame because he'd done something horrible with his own biological daughter. Joe pleaded with Adrian not to reveal the truth to Marie, who didn't know Joe was her biological father. But Adrian, feeling that his revenge was complete, decided to do the unthinkable and left Joe devastated. The next day, Joe went to see Cheney with a bag of diamonds he got from Adrian. It turns out Joe asked Cheney to put him back in his isolation room, and he decided to lock himself up there forever. The end. Moral lesson from the story: don't let your personal life interfere with your job, or you could find yourself stuck in a room for 2 decades.